Greetings. I'm Yvonne Stapp for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations. We hear a lot about ecosystems these days when numerous environmental and climate conditions threaten the survival of many organisms. So today we learn how ecosystems develop, function, and adapt, regardless of the type or scale. Our guest is James O'Dwyer, Associate Professor of Plant Biology at the University of Illinois, Urbana, and Hrdy Fellow this year at Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Dr. O'Dwyer specializes in the dynamics of complex biological systems. He brings to this field a distinguished background in physics and mathematical modeling, and fields that are essential today to understanding complex biological systems. We are delighted to welcome via Zoom Dr. James O'Dwyer. Dr. O'Dwyer, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, and I would like to start, please, with a statement you made that ecosystems are the archetypal complex systems. Would you please explain? That's a very interesting and important statement. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, that's a tough one to start with because it's a complicated explanation, and it's also an explanation that people don't necessarily agree on. You know what a complex system is.
Right.
So I'll tell you what makes for me ecosystems and ecological communities really interesting complex systems. It's several features really. One is they're extremely heterogeneous. You know, as you mentioned, I had a background in physics, and you know, no one has their own personal favorite electron, right? They're all pretty much the same. In ecology, that's not true. You know, you have many of my colleagues who will focus their entire careers on really fascinating behavior of a particular species, right? That's their real focus of interest. And yet, you know, you look across the natural world, and that's, you know, every species has its own interesting features and behavior and traits. And so you could apply that many times over, that interest. So there's that great heterogeneity in any ecological system. Everything's very different, even within species. Then everything is interactive. So all of those component parts within an ecological system make it very difficult to know where to draw the box. And that's sort of one of my, you know, defining ways of thinking about an ecological system is it's really important and yet really difficult to know where to draw the box around what you're looking at. And you can look at the properties or the traits and behavior, the genomics of an individual organism. You can look at a population. You can look at a community of similar species. You can look at something more like a food web where you have very different species. You can get to the ecosystem scale where you're thinking about many different communities maybe and different flows of nutrients, and then you've got the biosphere. So where do you draw those lines to make it tractable to look at? It's a really interesting and challenging question. But the bottom line is everything is interacting to some extent.
Yes. So that's the important thing. Can you give us an example or two of an ecosystem? Because maybe people are less clear what constitutes an ecosystem. It's a word that's used a great deal today.
Sure. So, you know, we do like to think about different scales in ecology. And so coming down from the top end, you've got the entire biosphere. That's the Earth and everything on it, you know, all life, the nutrients, the other physical elements life is interacting with. Then we also like to kind of split things up a bit at smaller scales than the entire Earth. So there are different biome types. Those are largely defined by physical conditions. So for example, terrestrial versus aquatic biomes. Also temperature, precipitation, sort of bulk physical characteristics like this. And then within a biome, so defined by that sort of contiguous area of similar physical characteristics, environmental characteristics, you could have multiple ecosystems. So you could have, for example, a coral reef ecosystem in the marine environment, and that's many organisms, many different species interacting, as we've said. And usually you would think of an ecosystem as comprising the organisms, their interactions, and also the resources around them that they're using and producing, all of that together. And so, so within one of those broad scale biome types, you might have many different ecosystems of that type.
I'd like to center just for a minute on something like a well-known and now currently threatened ecosystem that you just brought up. The coral reef systems are very vulnerable just now. So that in fact, many these nature documentaries have been done about how fascinating these things are, but you have a lot of interdependence there. Can you tell us how that interdependence works? What do we mean by that? For example, just that as an example, or some other one?
Yeah, sure. So, there are a huge range of different types of species within a coral reef. So you think the coral polyps, which are sort of the core of it, I guess. Maybe that's not the right word, but sort of something central that we think about. And so these are animals living within the reef, trying to gather nutrients. But there are really incredible interdependencies with bacteria, with fish, other marine organisms. There's an interaction with the environment, so the water temperature is really critically important. So the overall diversity is huge, and the interactions are incredibly strong. And thinking about cooperative interactions, coral reefs are probably among the best examples for both the importance of cooperative interactions, but also their vulnerability to some extent, because the resilience of these systems to changing environment around them is, every ecological system has some degree of resilience. Whether they're able to withstand the degree to which we and other environmental changes are pushing them, coral reefs are very vulnerable.
Right. I would just like to probe that a wee bit more, that there are very often, I think we're not aware that things that we think are the enemy, like the predator type animals in these things, operate or tend to be very important. And over again, we see this situation. So there is a fish, I can't remember whether it's a parrotfish, some fish with an enormous beak that comes along and munches the corals. But that then goes through the fish's digestive system and produces sand, and that's where we get sand. So this is fairly important. And again, all of these characteristics seem to be extremely important. Plants, the animals, you mentioned bacteria, and so on, right? So and I'd like to ask you about balance in this. And I thought of that when I saw the archetypal complex system. That's it.
Balance is a really, I think there's clearly a role of balance of one kind or another in every ecological system. That doesn't necessarily mean they have to be incredibly finely tuned, I suppose. That's one way of saying it. There is always a degree of resilience. I think there was one of the earliest definitions of communities was actually an ecologist who was associated with University of Illinois, where I am now, Stephen Forbes. And it's not that people haven't thought about ecological communities for centuries and more before this, of course. So to some extent, this is when somebody wrote down the word rather than when somebody had the first idea. But he talked about communities of common interest. And he recognized the importance of those balancing effect, that there may be competitors or predator-prey relationships, which were nevertheless important for the community. So that was really early recognition of this. This was sort of the late 19th, early 20th century.
Wow.
He thought, though, at that time, maybe this will lead us later on to thinking about the benefits of modeling and thinking about ecological systems quantitatively. He wondered how these, say, feeding rates, would they have to be, and he was looking at lakes in Illinois and Wisconsin, I think, around the Midwest area. Would feeding rates have to be extremely finely tuned to avoid predator and prey, predator or prey going extinct? And it's sort of a little bit aligned, I think, with what you're getting at in coral reefs or many other systems we could talk about. And I think that that's to some extent true. That balance, the range of biodiversity in a given system, it's clearly incredibly important. But there is some scope for ecological systems to withstand or to be resilient in the face of changes, environmental changes or changes in feeding rates or things like this. And so, yeah, there's a balance between thinking about ecosystems as finely balanced and resilient. And the truth is somewhere in between. And I think that the modeling and mathematics, we'll get to that point in our conversation, I'm sure. There are limitations. We're describing what I've called an archetypal complex system. There are limitations to what we can say about those mathematically so far, and the modeling that we have. On the other hand, it can give us some insights into that balance between fine-tuning and resilience. That's sort of another hallmark of ecological systems, I think.
Right. I understand. I'm very eager to get to that mathematical modeling here, just to go through a few things here first. So we have this idea of the creatures, plants, atmosphere, all these environment things have to sort of go together. They are, I think you would say that they are self-organizing systems. Nobody puts this all together in a recipe, but they simply form and balance over time themselves. And you say, well, there is some flexibility in there, and I imagine it depends on what the threats are. But in any case, can you give us some examples of things that destabilize? Is there any general thing, or do you have to go to a specific ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you do have to go to specific cases. We've in this community of people thinking about these questions, certainly that there is an overarching goal of trying to identify general features that lead to instability or destabilizing an ecological system. And I'll come back to those in a moment, but I'll maybe give you a specific example as well. So it's a nice example of where the theory and the modeling connects with what you see in empirical systems. And so it's the idea of eutrophication of lakes, where there's nutrient runoff, largely caused by humans. I mean, there's going to be some natural nutrient inflow, like phosphorus, for example, going into lakes, but we can often accelerate that process. And the idea is to think about, well, what changes in that lake system as you add nutrients to it? It sounds like a good thing, right? That sort of eutrophication sounds like it's going to work out great. But it can lead to the growth of algal blooms, and those can make it very difficult for other organisms, both the synthetic organisms that are trying to grow underneath them, and then the huge range of other fish, insects, everything else in those lakes can really find it very difficult to survive, because they're almost choked by these algal blooms, you could say. And so the interesting thing related to stability there is, you might think, okay, right, I've added a lot of nutrients that's helped the algal populations to grow, right? It's had this negative effect. So maybe I'll just be able to scale that back and come back to where I was. And it doesn't work that way. And so there was an interesting theory proposed about this, and it's borne out by the empirical data that you have to, if you like, ramp all the way back almost to nothing before you can get back to that stable state you were in, the stable ecosystem you started with. And what's happened is, if you can kind of picture in your head maybe two valleys separated by a hill in the middle, pushing that system with this nutrient inflow to a different state has sort of pushed you over the hill in the middle, and you've gotten into this entirely different state dominated by the algae.
Yes.
And so going back again, when you ramp the nutrient inflow back, you kind of stay in that second valley. It doesn't push you automatically back over the hill to where you started.
Yeah.
And it's not till you ramp everything back to the beginning that the hill gets smaller and you can find your way back to now a very minimal, but now potentially healthy ecosystem in your lake. And so that's a hugely important for recovering those systems, because it's not easy. It's not like you just ramp down to where you were before and get back easily to where you were in terms of the health of that system. And so that's all about stability. Even that visual of valleys and hills in the middle, that's not even too far off from the way you would think about this mathematically. It's really a question of being near to one equilibrium state or approximately equilibrium state and pushing it all the way over the hill to another, and you kind of get stuck there. And so that process destabilized that first equilibrium state and pushed you towards another. And so that idea of bistability of ecological systems crops up in a few other places. In, for example, savanna and forest systems, there can be transitions between the two.
Almost anywhere.
Right, it comes up all over the place. And so we have there. So that example is it's for a specific system, shallow lakes usually, but actually those ideas can cross to many other ecological systems. And so that's an example. Yeah, it kind of has all the elements we've talked about so far. There's human input.
Yes.
There's a mathematical picture to kind of help us understand
come to that, right?
And then
yes,
there's kind of the conservation impact of how we use that.
Right.
Picture.
Well, this is why your work is so important, because so many of these systems now throughout nature, throughout the history of life, this has always been a problem. But right now, it is very urgent to try to understand it because of the rate of extinction, the threats that are novel through climate change and through pollution of toxins, that sort of thing. Threatening is the things that threaten many ecosystems. And how they are joined it's just an enormous thing. And so your work is right at the center of this. We would have to have this kind of modeling and your background. So welcome to the crisis.
Yeah.
Very interesting that you are doing this, at this time. So would you tell us what it is that you do, that this in terms of this modeling and what that provides for understanding the situation of ecosystems?
Yeah, great questions. And it is a time where climate is changing, and also in other ways, humans are, if you like, having an outsized impact on the natural world. One factor there that's important, and it's something I'm seeking to develop in my work, and other colleagues of mine have done amazing work on doing this, but it's sort of fairly recent, and that is really integrating humans and the natural world in our ways of thinking about them. We for a long time, and again, some of this goes back, sort of the academic version of ecology, which only goes back so far, but for a long period within that discipline, we've thought about food webs or ecological communities as separate from humans.
Yes.
And of course they are not. And there's not to say there's not some value in externalizing humans and focusing on our effects on those systems, but really, something that I think is important is to recognize how how we're intertwined with all of it.
Yes.
And so it's only been recently that papers are being published with humans as part of a food web and trying to understand their role in the same way, in the same light as the way we might understand an apex predator or keystone species. Those concepts which we've looked for in food webs for a long time, humans can play just as an important role as any other species.
Right, but an intrusive one, very often.
Very often intrusive, yeah, that's right. And so, so my work, some of it has been in recent years trying to get at more general rules for stability and resilience in ecological systems, and now beginning to think about how we integrate, well, both how the ideas, the ways that economists and social scientists have modeled human behavior, both can we draw from those ideas alone and sort of understand, are there commonalities with the way we understand ecological systems and vice versa, and putting those two domains together, because I think they're so closely linked. The economics, the social interactions we have, they're part of that study of the ecological complex systems.
Okay,
in a way.
so you do include all of that, the human webs, multiple webs, economic, sociological, all of these different kinds of things. Evidently, you include that in this idea. And I'd like to really emphasize that yours was the first work that I had seen. For example, I thought I followed things pretty carefully, but that included this human dimension. And so I really want to understand that. That's very important.
Well, let me say a couple of things. One is that, some of my colleagues have certainly been there before me. Colleagues at the Santa Fe Institute, where I was before I came to the University of Illinois, for example, have been really instrumental in, first of all, modeling food webs. That's one of the great successes of, I would say, what ecological modeling can bring to our understanding of ecosystems, but then also including humans in those food webs. So so there's definitely really interesting work. It was maybe underexplored for a long time, but interesting work bringing humans into that picture. And yes, that's my work has mainly been ecological up until the last couple of years. And part of my project at Radcliffe, for example, is integrating those domains. That's sort of it all led me to that set of questions. You can see overlaps clearly between what humans are, interactions among ourselves, or the way we normally think about them, but they're always linked with, say, resource use and resource extraction. Feeding ourselves has huge impacts on ecological systems, and not just feeding ourselves, but all the many other resources that we use for all sorts of purposes. All of that led me to thinking that to understand stability and resilience in ecological systems, it would be really hard or impossible not to think about social and economic systems intertwined with those. And the other part, which is sort of really fascinating to me, is that we often use the same kind of language to describe those systems. There are commonalities. We think, about competition and cooperation in human societies. We think often about stability. Look at the various financial crises that economies in the US have suffered over decades. Those are a form of instability, maybe not totally unlike ecological instability. And then the various relationships between humans have at least a qualitative similarity to the way that ecological communities and their interactions play out. Not exactly the same. That's part of my interest, is understanding where the differences are.
Yes, that's what I wanted to ask you about. I didn't know whether to consider that an idea of scale, so that some of the things that apply to human society, because we can make conscious decisions, because we can move about, because we interfere so much with other natural systems, is that a difference of scale because there are some commonalities, or is it, would anybody argue, no, that's a different thing? The human society has some of these rough commonalities with natural systems, but there are these real distinctions. But you would say, no, this is just like that.
I would say I wouldn't say it's just like that, but I want to push our understanding as far as it can go. And
okay,
yeah, for sure, the nuances of and variety of human behavior may make that goal very difficult. I fully acknowledge that, but I want to push it as far as it can go to see if we can understand something about the way humans and the natural world interact, and what the consequences are of the way our society is organized for us and the natural world. Now, I'm happy if that effort fails. I'm okay with it. If that breaks down. But I want to push that understanding as far as it can go.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, I understand. So there are these commonalities, but then is any part of your work concerned with, well, if humans have these characteristics, but also have at this time a responsibility to try to revive or preserve natural ecosystems that don't have the flexibility that we do, can't make the decisions that we do, and have suffered because of us, then is that something different, or is that?
That's a great question. I would say my instinct is to say, yes, we have that responsibility.
Okay.
It's going to be hard to do.
But that's a different feature of an ecosystem. In order to be a part of this other ecosystem, we have to do some decisive things. In other words, it seems like, but I don't know.
Certainly our interactions with the rest of the natural world, they'll play out differently depending on whether we take up that responsibility or not.
Yes.
How successful we're thinking about climate change alone, leading to, for example, extinctions, at least local extinctions of many species, range shifts, leading to different interactions, right? Because not every species range is going to shift in the same way.
Exactly.
I'm not going to say it's out of our control, because of course that's down to us.
Right. But so we have to do that in order to, but we have to make decisions. So that's very different from, say, other ecosystems. So in order for these other ecosystems, is my point, that in order for them to survive, we have to decide to take action and actually do anything. I would like to just ask you a question about this. In terms of adaptability must be part of your modeling. I'm not sure, but is there a way to get at this? It seems like a really complicated thing. So I'm just asking.
Well, so there's, just like the way ecologists think about where to draw the box around what they're interested in, those different scales from the organism up to the biosphere, adaptation plays out at all those scales. So we're kind of used to thinking about adaptation at the level of an individual organism, like classic studies of moths in England in polluted towns versus not, which actually is an interesting story that people continue to debate until relatively recently. But in any case, different color adaptations to avoid predation. That's sort of an adaptive feature which makes sense to us at the very least. It's intuitive. But now we also started this conversation talking about the real importance of interactions in ecological systems, and they can be of all types: cooperative, competitive, predator, prey, trophic interactions, we would call those, but one thing eating another. All of those are really critically important for for species to survive. And so it's not just those examples where we can see, oh, a particular trait changed in an individual population. We can sort of see how it had adaptive benefits. It's a question of how can a community of organisms, how will it change? How will their interactions change? Can they change quickly enough? Can they change and withstand some organisms in effect leaving that community if they go extinct or locally extinct or they move somewhere else? So yeah, so that question is really at the center of my research of how a community can withstand changes in its environment. And one way I think about ecological communities is that in many ways, they may be optimized for withstanding certain kinds of variation from the outside, like that's cooperative interaction. So for example, in microbial communities, it's almost inevitable that when so microbes will often take up resources like sugars to eat, that will help their to maintain their cells, populations to grow. They're almost inevitably produce byproducts of those processes, just like we do. And but those byproducts are often useful for somebody else.
That's right.
Just like our byproducts are, right? That for other organisms. And so there are cooperative interactions there almost inevitably. And so one element of my research is to understand how those cooperative interactions are helping communities to withstand changes in their external environment. So for example, one way that that can happen is through some element of redundancy. So maybe you like to eat this particular kind of organic carbon source, but it's not always around, right? Maybe it's variable, so that the environment you're facing is variable. If you have a cooperative interaction with somebody else who produces a resource that you can use, that's one way to mitigate that environmental variability, to kind of smooth it out. And so the way communities smooth out the environment they experience is really central in the way I think about the resilience of ecological systems. But there are going to be limits to that. And what we, to some extent, alone are imposing, but maybe, I don't want to say it's entirely humans, but a large amount of the changes faced by the natural world are down to our impacts. It's not as obvious that communities will withstand those.
Yeah, and so much of the interference and destruction from humans, and it's planetary at this point, is toxic or stuff that we have produced. It's not naturally produced. So that is of interest. And I hope that I'm sure it will come up in your modeling of this. I wish we could go on. This is very interesting. I would like to emphasize before we leave that I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about this. I want to say, if I can take just one more minute of time here, that your background is quite unique, but I think it's becoming more common in biology. And people often think of biology as some separate thing, but in fact, physicists have contributed a great deal, and mathematicians most certainly today. And we're going to see that increasingly for exactly, I think, the reason that you stated, that the ecosystems with the quintessential biological structure, that they are the archetype of complex systems. And so we need you in that regard. Before we leave, could you quickly tell us how you came through this most interesting path of I believe, was it theoretical physics, and then I don't know whether it was a mathematics separately, or what, if you would, a little bio, please.
It's probably, like you say, maybe a slightly unusual route. Not by any means am I the only person with that background in this field.
Right.
I will say, before maybe jumping into that brief history, it's really important to me to be at home in a biology department here. I think interdisciplinary work, certainly I've learned it's hard, but I also have learned you really have to immerse yourself in it. And so I enjoy taking groups of students out to identify trees or look at geological formations here in Illinois. We have a very changed habitat here, of course. So the prairie parkland that we had originally has some small remnants of both prairie and forest still left. Anyway, so I enjoy doing that too. And that's really important. I think it's not just treating biology as just another part of physics, right? It is its own thing. And yet, for sure, when when people get it right, the overlap of mathematics and physics and really the interaction across domains, super important. And so I'm totally on board with that. But it's certainly a challenging to make those connections. So how did I get here? I think when I was an undergraduate student, I remember talking to a prof about what to study at grad school, and that was all going to be within applied math and physics at that point. I wasn't thinking about biology so much, but he said at that point, it's really important to follow your nose. And so that's sort of always what I've done, honestly. I've always thought it's you have to be a little bit strategic about what you work on just to keep going, of course, but I've always thought I'm going to be so much more productive working on questions that I'm passionate about, that I think are important, that have some value to them. And so that's always the guideline I've had in mind, is to kind of keep those principles at the forefront when thinking about what questions to work on. So at the same time, I was very happy working in theoretical physics. I was working on the physics of phase transitions, which isn't a million miles away. Yeah, another super interesting subject, and with many interesting connections with the way we think about transitions in ecological systems. I get in trouble with some of my former physics colleagues, though, for saying that in ecology it's just much harder. And it comes down to exactly where we started, that heterogeneity, right? Makes everything harder. And not just that, but the fact that things are adapting over time. You're rarely dealing with something that's in equilibrium for long. So to me, there's overlap with those questions I was interested in at the time during my PhD, but it's a lot harder and more fun and challenging as well.
More fun.
I got to the end of that. I loved it, but I felt I was working on sort of a corner of a picture that was already pretty well traced out, and I knew there were going to be interesting open questions in other fields, and I was probably naive at that point. This was, 13, 14 years ago, something like that. And I thought, okay, some of what I've learned in physics really could be important in understanding ecological systems. Now, I didn't know how hard it would be to even formulate those questions in the right way. I just had the intuition that it might be. And that was the naive part. But I mean, there's some truth in it, that there was scope there for that overlap to work really well. It just takes a lot of time and work. And I wasn't able to do it as quickly as I thought I would do at that point.
Yes. This is most interesting. A couple of things that you've really implied, that we're going to have to think in more complex terms, period, to understand a lot of areas of science, and interdisciplinary backgrounds are extremely helpful at this point. We have interdisciplinary teams, but being interdisciplinary on your own is very important. And I think your words are extremely encouraging for young people in science. Follow your nose. When you are curious about something, go for it. And I think that what you have done is a great example for them. I look forward to hearing more about your work, and I'm sure we're all going to hear much more about you in years to come. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us all this wonderful information.
Fantastic. Thank you, Yvonne. Thanks for having me.
What a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.
you.